major part of the paper is dedicated to Daniel Markovic, which I pronounce Markovic because he's obviously somewhere from former Yugoslavia. One of us. I discuss also the liberal view in some different versions, compare the two positions and try to offer a defense of the liberal proposals. So the Republican view, when I say the Republican view, I simply identify this with Markovic's view. And the liberal views that I will show diverge in the way they remark the role of civil disobedience in democracy. However, both the Republicans as well as most of the liberals see civil disobedience as an unavoidable component of democracy. So, as Markovic says, is needed corrective of democracy, needed part of democracy, and also Rawls says it's a needed aspect of the theory of democracy. So I start by Markovic, who obviously starts by criticizing the liberal proposal because it is the dominant proposal in the discussion of civil disobedience. As he says, liberals have tried to defend the legitimacy of civil disobedience, he calls it political disobedience, by remarking the necessity to limit democracy in order to protect a pre-established valid conception of justice. So what typically the liberal thinks is that we can establish what is just independently of the democratic procedure. And the democratic institutions sometimes go in the wrong direction, and we must correct these mistakes. So it's, I would say, deficits of justice, as I was also saying in the discussion with Snezhana. While on the other hand, the Republican attempts to justify political, now I quote, to justify political disobedience from within democratic theory, emphasizing the support that political disobedience can provide for the broader political process by correcting democratic deficits in law and policy that inevitably threatens democracy. For liberalism, democracy is instrumental, which is visible for what I said earlier, and it must be limited when it conflicts with justice. While for the Republican, democracy is essential, it's self-sustaining, and it must be improved for its own sake. So, Republicanism is the theory according to which, quote, persons are free only insofar as they are governed by laws that they have given themselves. And this is a classical definition. In such an order, the citizens identify themselves as co-authors with the common decisions, even when their proposals are not supported by the response of voting. This is particularly important, as what Markovic remarks as the distinctive aspect of republicanism. Democratic decisions are not just the decisions of the majority, however. So democratic procedure for republicanism is not only majoritarian rule. Among the mechanisms that supplement the majoritarian rule, there are mechanisms that engage aggregation, both of parties at the parliament as well as before elections. So the goal of these mechanisms that supplement the majoritarian rule is to obtain that also people who were outvoted nevertheless feel as co-authors of the decisions. However, unfortunately, these mechanisms may cause democratic deficits for several reasons. One of them, obviously, is the most banal, is that particular interests may prevail. But there may be more interesting causes of deficits. I skip on the blue part, because that was the longer version. So when a democratic government opts for a policy, and here we see an interesting source of the deficit, it puts out of the political agenda some considerations. So, for example, a government that opts for building a lot of sports objects around the country may put out of the political agenda the building of cultural objects. And in some sense, for some time, this is even required, because in order to have the same as in individual action, in order to have the possibility to act, you must establish your priorities and simply ignore reasons that speak against the decision you take. So you are only become focused on your main reason. The same for the individual, the same for the government. However, here obviously it happens in inertia. So after a government establishes a policy, it ignores other reasons in order to enforce or pursue its policy. So here, however, it appears an inertia that may render difficult to change the ordering of considerations. For some time, as I said, this may be good, for otherwise it is impossible to realize politics. However, this inertia can also become a deficit of democracy. And this happens when it appears a distance between government's policy and preferences of citizens, which threatens the democratic authority of the institutions. So in the first moment the government was realizing what resulted for the democratic procedure, but after some time, for example, they can diverge very strongly the preferences of the population, as it happened in Croatia, for example. There were moments where people was enthusiastic about these sports objects around the country, or we will have the World Championship in handball, etc. In another moment, the government was still realizing these sports objects, but because of the economic crisis, people was more interested about health services, education services, and so on. But the government still was saying, well, but this was the politics, we decided. And here we had, obviously, a democratic deficit. One of the ways in which it may appear the distance between government and citizens is that an issue is put out of the political agenda and that it remains in this status even when citizens have a different opinion, what I was saying a minute ago. It may happen as well that the policy is never officially endorsed, or that it is realized the application of a very different policy from that officially established. Nebojša and Snježana remarked two cases. The first is Nebojša, who said, the government said, we are the society of knowledge, everybody must have the possibility to learn, which in fact didn't happen in the real life. Or what Snježana also remarks as the situation of the government says, equal access to all employments for everybody, but in fact the real life situation is very different, accessed only for some specific members of some specific groups. In this way, it is lost the sense of the citizens that she is the co-author of the process of public decision making, which is a relevant requirement of the Republican theory. In such cases, we have important deficits of democracy. Political disobedience in these conditions become a relevant counterweight to the institutions and practices that cause deficits. These institutions were the mechanisms of aggregation that I mentioned above, that were needed to improve democracy as not being just the realization of the majoritarian rule. And these same mechanisms that were needed to improve democracy now become the source of the democratic deficits. If properly practiced, so political disobedience may help to correct the deficits and to develop democracy. So, to put again on the political agenda these issues removed and not again or never put on the political agenda because of this inertia that in fact is structural to democracy as understood by the Republicans, that is, democracy not as mere majoritarian rule. So the same thing that exists to improve democracy also has the side effect of causing inertia of democracy, and wrong inertia, that is deficits of democracy. This means that something else is needed. That something else is political disobedience. So, quotation, indeed the argument has shown democratic disobedience to be an unavoidable, even integral part of a well-functioning democratic process. The defense of civil disobedience offered by Markovic is obviously as an alternative to the liberal view, and this is what he explicitly declares. According to the liberal view, the main justification of civil disobedience is represented by the protection of basic liberties and rights, as well as the conscientious choices of persons. In the case of conscientious choices, I refer to Ronald Dworkin, for example, who indicates this as a very important justification of civil disobedience. And both these, so basic liberties and rights, as well as conscientious choices, can be neglected by the majority rule of the democratic process. The intention of civil disobedience, according to this approach, is to appeal to the sense of justice of the majority, so that protection of basic rights and liberties, as well as of the conscientious choices of persons, are obtained. So, for example, as Rawls remarks, or also I would add Martin Luther King, civil disobedience is required to awake the sense of justice of the majority, saying, well, but look, if you really awake, if you really start acting your sense of justice, you will see that you can't accept a practice like the Jim Crow, for example. The Jim Crow is the name for this system of racial discrimination and segregation in the south of the United States, so that proposed by the civil rights movements and Martin Luther King. So, where does Markovic see the comparative advantages of the Republican model over the liberal model? He thinks about two advantages. The first one is related to what he sees as a defect of the liberal model, that is the fact that civil disobedience in the liberal model is strictly goal-oriented. This means that civil disobedience can be activated whenever there is a part of population that thinks that there are grave denials of human rights of the kinds indicated. Moreover, civil disobedience can last as long as the objective is not obtained. This can create some problems. Civil disobedience can become coercive, a substitute of the democratic procedure and not a supplement to it. A related problem is that social chaos becomes possible. These problems are avoided by the Republican justification of civil disobedience. In this case, civil disobedience is justified only in cases when there are deficits in the democratic procedure and only as long as these deficits are corrected. So, for example, in the case remarked by Snježana, if it is the government, like in most European countries, contrary to the United States, for example, if it is the government who pursues affirmative action, then the Republican will be happy until the moment the issue is put on the political agenda. So after the major political parties decide, okay, this is an interesting issue, let's discuss about this in the parliament, at this moment the Republican is happy. While the liberal would be happy if he thinks really that affirmative action is what is really needed to remove injustices. The liberal will be happy only if affirmative action is voted. So this is the relevant difference between the two positions. And Markovic thinks this is a defect of the liberal view, because in this view and because of this, disobedience becomes a substitute of the democratic procedure. Some kind also denial, we may say, of the democratic procedure. There is another problem related to that already indicated. Because of the risks of coercion and social chaos, some liberals, as for example John Rawls, restrict acceptance of disobedience to the core of liberties and human rights. In this way, such liberals like Rawls, do not render justice to cases of civil disobedience related to issues such as international politics or environmental policy, but also to issues of economic justice, which, as Markovic remarks, are the most interesting issues of civil disobedience in the contemporary actual situation. Well, the Republican model, as Markovic says, is open to such cases of civil disobedience, provided that there are democratic deficits related to these policies. Before entering in a more detailed analysis of these problems, I indicated problems of the Republican proposal. So here I try to say something in opposition to Markovic. There are cases of so severe denials of human rights that it is really problematic to accept these situations as legitimate, provided only that they are covered by an appropriate democratic procedure. I think of situations like Jim Crow, opposed among others by Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement. So Markovic's proposal fits well with situations that are matters of decision, in the sense that every decision that results from an appropriate procedure is legitimate. But at least to a widely shared sensibility, I think, there are rights above democratic decisions. Here I pause for a moment. A crucial step in Markovic's argumentation is to show that the Republican stance toward democracy is superior to the liberal stances toward democracy. For liberals, democracy has value for two possible reasons. One is that democracy is a way to pursue equality. But the defect of such conception is that democracy is limited by substantial elements of equality, and therefore a wide range of decisions are outside its domain of decision. In another interpretation, democracy is supported by liberals as a way of pursuing reasonableness. The defect here is that democratic debate is limited by typical liberal constraints. That is, the collective choices are limited to options of equivalent liberal legitimacies. In both cases, says Markovic, the conceptions of democracy departs from what is widely agreed about it. In the public opinion, democracy is a self-sustaining value, and its procedures are less limited and its scope is wider than the liberals say. However, I think that things are not so simple. As a matter of fact, it is a widely shared position that there are some decisions that are so atrocious that they are beyond the scope of democratic deliberation. I refer to basic issues of human rights and non-discrimination. If the common conception is relevant to opt between theories here, it appears that liberalism has its own points of advantage over republicanism. As many think, we cannot take as legitimate a decision that supports racial or ethnic or religious segregation or discrimination, even when it is the result of the democratic procedure. This was the case in Jim Crow, even in relation to not explicitly racist people. As remarked by King and David Lyons, who say that people who officially are not racist, nevertheless are not sufficiently aware of problems caused by the segregation, and in fact, although unaware of this, they really are racists. We had a similar situation in Croatia related to the Roma in a region of Croatia who were put in segregated classrooms. And there was a case, a legal case lasting for, as I remember well, 12 years. At the end, Croatia lost at the Strasbourg Court of Human Rights. But in order to case how the case was difficult, only the final decision at Strasbourg indicated that Croatia was wrong. Even the first level of decision said Croatia was not wrong. I don't know, the English expression is malo vijeće, that first level of decision. Then there is the veliko vijeće, which is the final step of the Strasbourg Court. Yeah, the final, that's the top. Moreover, a specific relevant fact may be that some minorities can be not interested at all about the improvement of the democratic process, and therefore are totally outside the Republican framework. But what only the solution of their problems. So here are cases like the Amish or the Pueblo Indians, so people who say we totally do not care about improvement, democracy, we do not care about democratic deficits, we just want to be permitted to live according to our habits. To these people, the Republican model has no answer, no solution to give at all. So they are totally indifferent to what Marković is offering to them. And this is particularly relevant in cases of disobedience related to conscientious requirements. Here we may have subjects that do not make a direct appeal to justice, in the sense that they do not directly affirm that their behavior is the only just. Like in the refusal of the Jehovah's Witnesses to salute the flag. So they were not saying nobody, they do not say everybody must not salute the flag. They simply say we want to be left alone not to salute the flag. So they only affirm their right to behave as they conscientiously believe that it is proper. So like in the cases indicated by Kimberly before, earlier, so they do not want to change generally the law. They even do not need a general public debate about this. They simply say, let us permit to behave as we want. There are authors who remark that acting in accordance to conscience is the first of all rights, in virtue of corresponding to the deepest among human interests. It is actually my biggest enemy, Chandran Kuhatas, on whom I work in another paper in progress. Even if we do not take such a radical view, and I think that demands of conscience are important, but not so important as Kukatas are remarking. Certainly, we must admit that for many people, acting in accordance to conscience is much more important than being participants and co-authors in a procedure of public decisions on matters of common interest. And it seems to me that even to such people, Marković has nothing to offer at all. Nonetheless, I follow Marković in saying, this was in order to remark the problems of the Republican proposal. Nonetheless, I follow Marković in saying that problems appear for the liberals as well. One of them is represented by various conscientious requirements of minorities, not related and frequently even not coherent with the respect of human rights. The other problems, among else, are those already mentioned by Marković. So social chaos and coercive, to a restrictive scope of possible cases of civil disobedience. So, part of the solution is offered by John Rawls. Finally. But here I disagree with Rawls. Oops.
Hard to believe.
Hard to believe. So in the authoritative pronouncement of John Rawls, part of the solution to these troubles is to restrict the domain of issues suitable for civil disobedience to basic rights, mainly basic liberties and equal opportunities. The other part of the solution is represented by restricting this appeal to the commonly shared sense of justice. So the intention is not to change this sense of justice. The intention is to awake the sense of justice, to say, look, but even your sense of justice tell you, just look at the situation more carefully and you will see. So the goal of the disobedience is to enlighten the majority about the propriety of the requirement of the base of the common sense of justice. So we see very restrictive rules, and I think Rawls is too shy in defending civil disobedience. The third part of the solution regards readiness in accepting punishment. Disobedience must act in public and submit themselves to the punishment. And fourth, disobedience must be non-violent and non-coercive. This is not shared by all liberals. All parts, and as I'm now going to say, all parts of Rawls' proposal have been criticized even inside the liberal paradigm. For example, Brian Berry, my new hero, as you see from today also, indicates that the range of acceptable motivations for disobedience is too narrow. He indicates that people must be allowed to disobey for reasons of economic justice and for objections to public policy as well, even like the girlfriend of our friend and colleague Nebojša, who protested for the urbanistic policy in Zagreb, that is, that they were destroying one street in Zagreb. Berry refuses as well Rawls' requirements that disobedience, even in cases of deep injustices, must always limit their actions to non-violent behavior and be non-coercive, and must always be ready to accept punishment. So, as Berry would say, it would be outrageous to say that people discriminated by the Jim Crow really must be ready to accept punishment. I mean, they are already punished, what you even more required of them. If the only goal of disobedience is to appeal to a shared sense of justice, a sense of justice that recognizes common principles, and is only a way of public communication, it is difficult, Berry says, to see why it is justified at all. Other forms of communication can do all its job. So, for example, when we had this discussion about this cutting the flag in Rijeka recently, if we can obtain what is needed by simulating to disrespect the criminal law, this can be better than doing the same by really disrespecting by law. So saying, no, I'm not really cutting, I'm simply pretending to do this, and we see the pretension because I do this as an artistic performance, that would be better than civil disobedience as such. But Berry can agree with this, that if the same behavior can be as effective as the other, then no disobedience can be better. But what Berry remarks as the problem, that if the justification of disobedience is so shy, as remarked by Rawls, then it really appears that civil disobedience is never justified, that this shy scope can be obtained by other forms of communication as well. So if we are so shy as Rawls, disobedience can never be justified. This is Berry's position. So far I have discussed problems and attempts of solutions related to the issues of coercive civil disobedience and possible social chaos in virtue of the many communities that may appeal to even wrong various conscientious reasons for civil disobedience. There remains a further problem, remarked by Markovic as a reason of superiority of the Republican theory of civil disobedience over the liberal theory. The justification of disobedience directed toward bad policies. For example, in foreign affairs, environmental policy, even urbanistic policy, like in our Zagreb case. In fact, contrary to Rawls, there are liberals who justify civil disobedience also in relation to public policies, like Dworkin, who was speaking about the protest about the nuclear weapons policy in Europe, or more specifically in Germany, or Berry, who also wrote about a possible case of protest for urbanistic reasons. Why there is something on this road, street and not in another street. The question, however, is whether such attitude has a coherent justification in liberalism. I mean, attitudes like Dworkin's or Berry's, who would extend possible justified case of disobedience. As we have seen at the beginning of the paper, liberalism do not attribute an absolute authority to democracy. Basic liberties and basic issues of equality are above the domain of democratic decision. However, when not dealing with these issues, democratic decision is sovereign. More specifically, for liberals, majoritarian decisions most of the time. So, the question is, on what grounds can liberals justify disobedience outside the domain of basic liberties and basic issues of equality? If these issues, other issues, are really issues for democratic decision and not something above this. So, where have we arrived in the discussion? I have shown problems for the Republican views in opposition to Markovic, and I have shown problems of the Republican proposal, or liberal proposal, by following Markovic and adding something to Markovic's proposal. There are problems both on the liberal as well as on the Republican side. The problem of the Republican side is that it is insufficiently sensitive towards substantial denials of human rights and denials of conscience. The problem of the liberal side is that it is either sufficiently careful of issues of human rights and conscience, but then various problems of misuse of civil disobedience appear, or it is too shy, like the latter case is the Rawlsian proposal, the problem of the Rawlsian proposal. Moreover, there is a problem related to protests toward public policies. Now I look for possible replies, solutions of the problems in the liberal proposal. First, I speak about disobedience related to issues of human rights and conscientious concern. Here it is important to distinguish among establishing whether disobedience is legitimate on one side and opposition and sanctioning of civil disobedience on the other. So even when civil disobedience is legitimate, sanctions can be legitimate as well. And here I think I speak in coherence, by Kimberly can correct me, in coherence with her paper, when he shows that both disobedience as well as the reaction of the state can be forms of communication. So this is the reason why I say that disobedience is legitimate as a form of communication, saying you are infringing my conscience, for example. But it can be also legitimate the reaction of the state by punishing this person, by saying, yes, I appreciate that you are a conscientious person and this is a noble attitude. But nevertheless, I indicate you that your conscience is telling you wrong things to do. For example, if you withdraw your children for medical support. Rawls stands that people engaged in civil disobedience must be ready to be sanctioned for their behavior is justified. And this stance is shared by Martin Luther King. So in saying that we must admit to the state the possibility to punish people is also endorsed by theoreticians like Rawls and practitioners, who is also a theoretician, I would say, of civil disobedience, by Martin Luther King. They say we must not deny this right to the state. It can even be required as a component of civil disobedience, for example, as showing the sincerity of the disobedience. And in any case, independently of the possibility of showing the sincerity, I think there is an important point of not taking off this communicative possibility to the state. This possibility of sanctions is important for at least two reasons. The first one is to reduce motivations for frivolous or unreflective civil disobedience, which unfortunately is a problem for cases of civil disobedience we were speaking about. So certainly King would not appeal an instance of civil disobedience that stops because holidays starts. I mean, he would say this is not civil disobedience, it can be a party or something else, but not civil disobedience. The second one is to offer to the political society the possibility to protect itself from instability and social chaos, in particular when civil disobedience is pursued by fundamentalist communities irrespective of human rights or for illegitimate social interests. This does not mean, and I mentioned earlier also the communicative importance of leaving to the state the possibility to punish. This does not mean that the state must always apply sanctions, or that they must be proportionate to ordinary infractions of law. And here again I remark the communicative aspect. So sometimes by not applying, if the court says, here I would have to apply the sanction, but I do not. Also this can be a communication. For example, to Martin Luther King saying, because at the end we thank you very much for being helpful for our society, although you disobeyed the law. The opposition and sanctioning of civil disobedience can be stronger. Now I give some possible cases, but I do not obviously cover the full possible casuistry. The opposition and sanctioning of civil disobedience can be stronger in the cases when the state thinks that the obedience are justified in the sense that they appeal to a valid general reason, appeal to conscience, but the content of their requirement is not justified. The content, for example, is the requirement of conscience to withdraw medical treatment to the children. In such cases, the state can react firmly, although perhaps the firmness must come in grade and must go together with reasonableness to listen to the reasons of the communities, all individuals, and with the explanation of why the majority finds wrong the requirements. So the court has the obligation to explain why the demand of conscience is wrong in that specific case. In some cases, the state may recognize that disobedience were right and that their brave protest was based on justified requirements, incorrectly neglected by the wider community, for example in cases of strike for civil rights. In these cases, the state may suspend sanctions or opt for alternative or feeble forms of sanctioning. As I was told by lawyers, in Croatia it is not possible to suspend sanctions, or in general in the European law system, but it is possible to opt for alternative or feeble forms of sanctioning, or to express the sanction as an admonition. It is called, how to say, the condition sanctioning. The sanction will become effective if you repeat your action. Obviously, there is no guarantee in advance that either the state's reasons or the disobedience reasons are valid. Disobedience can be an instrument to start a dialogue between the two parts. Now I have 3 more slides. Is there enough time? 5 minutes? Okay, there is. So the green means if there is time. The blue meant only if there is a lot of time. The second general question, disobedience related to public policy, opens an important issue, that is the value of democracy for liberalism. Markovic is right in indicating that democracy has mostly an instrumental value for liberalism, and that its sovereignty is limited by considerations of justice. However, it is quite natural for liberals to find a strong alliance with democracy. The reason is that democracy, and most precisely that of the kind supported by Republicans, is the best protections of liberties and equality. And here I lie to the first hero of my life, which actually was the first hero also of the life of Barry, John Stuart Mill. We see this if we think about how basic liberties and equality can be protected in the public institutions. There are good reasons to think, by relying on the thoughts of John Stuart Mill, that in order to protect her freedom, everyone must be permitted to have access to the decisional process in public institutions in order to have the possibility to do this by herself. Moreover, institutional arrangements, more or less of the kind indicated by Markovich to avoid mere majoritarianism, are required by Mill as well, maybe in different forms, but the intention is the same. The intention being to avoid democracy as mere majoritarianism. So Mill was thinking about techniques of organized voting that will favor aggregational mechanisms. Even a measure he was proposing, the plural voting, which meant that everybody has right to one vote, but some people, the morally most noble, has a right to even more than one vote, is according to me wrongly interpreted as an elitarian measure. In fact, it is a measure that wants to respect this Republican requirement of forcing people to depart from mere majoritarianism and to go in the direction of these aggregative mechanisms. We see from this that although democracy is instrumental for liberalism, it is nevertheless an extremely important and unavoidable instrument. For this reason, liberals can welcome all means that improve democracy as something beyond mere majoritarianism. This opens the door for liberals to welcome all cases of disobedience indicated by Markovich, meant to eliminate democratic deficits. My conclusion is that liberalism can answer to the challenges indicated by Markovich, that it can incorporate all good solutions of the Republican proposal, and that it has something more to offer precisely to answer to the problems that I remarked in relation to the Republican proposal.
Yeah, I think I probably agree with everything you said. Maybe one attempt to defend Markovich, with respect to your comments on conscience and sort of the inability of the Republican position to give space to people like the Amish or those who are not, the claim being that their civil disobedience would not be justified because it's not oriented toward a contribution to a democratic process. Is that objection based on understanding Markovich's view about the justified civil disobedience as one that requires that you have a certain kind of intention, that you intend to be engaging in democratic contribution? But if we understood Markovich's view as not sort of an action guiding account, but rather just an assessment of whether your civil disobedience was defensible, if it succeeds in promoting democratic discussion and furthering the debate, even if the intentions were entirely different, would it not be justified on his view? In which case you'd say, well, I can accommodate Amish people, their acts of conscience, their attempts to be distant from the democratic process, if it indeed furthers democratic reflection, then it's a defensible form of civil disobedience. But not, well, they probably wouldn't label they're doing civil disobedience, but we can still capture it in our public view.
Yeah, maybe I have to try to explain better what I was trying to say, because one aspect of Markovich's argument is, in order to remark the superiority of his proposal, is to say it is better in accordance with pre-theoretical intuitions about democracy. So people, in fact, in our society do not see democracy in the way liberals picture democracy. What I was trying to say that I'm not sure about this, even more, I would say I'm sure about the contrary, that really there are people, at least on some issues, thinking like the liberals, saying, well, okay, but there are some issues above democratic procedure. And there are other people not even sharing the liberal view, but simply caring about their conscience. That in this sense they have no such pre-theoretic intuitions about democracy, that they even do not care about democracy. And although maybe at the end of the day Markovic would say, well, it's nothing wrong for me if their intention in starting civil disobedience is not to resolve democratic deficit, but it is to find a solution that permits to live them according to their conscience. I think, nevertheless, what they expect in the political society is not simply that their issue is put on the political agenda, but that their conscience is respected. So in this sense, I was simply saying that Markovic is not covering really what are so diffuse pre-theoretical political intuitions.
Yeah.
Can I just follow up on this? But is there any sensitive distinction we can draw in some kind of the agential perspective and the theorist perspective on the issue? Can it be that every act of civil disobedience can be reinterpreted as an act that is contributing to democracy? So really the intention of the agent is not so relevant for a justification of it as accepted. But this is something that's bothering me from the beginning about the civil disobedience, this insistence on the agential story. Those you introduced like the Frankfurt, very elaborate, is enough for justification that we are in the position from the kind of theoretical perspective to place this, or maybe I'm not seeing. Why there is this insisting on the perspective of the agent? Once we are trying to justify it within a state or within certain political practices, so from the perspective of a certain political view on the state. Why there is this so important, the perspective of the agent, if we are in the realm of justifying?
Because of giving legitimacy to their action. So, first of all, what we must say, there is at least for most authors, I would say David Lyons perhaps is the only one not caring about this, of all people who I read. So Lyons said there is no more presumption in favor of law. So the law must prove its legitimacy the same as breaching the law. But I think he's totally insulated. And the common position is there is something in favor of law. So there is something in favor of saying it's not legitimate to breach the law. And then we must find reasons to if we want to defend civil disobedience, we must find reason to justify some acts. One of the reasons, for example, remarked by Dworkin, as far as I remember, is say, well, we must appreciate these noble people. So there can be a difference between, let's say, somebody cynically thinking about his personal economic interests and somebody really acting on conscience. Think about these two cases. There is a person who withdraw medical treatment from the child.
Save money.
yeah, in order to save money. There is another one that does this for religious reason. And, I must admit I do not have an argument at the moment except what I already say, that it seems that the other one, although is wrong, has some nobility in her behavior or his behavior, and also is ready to a loss for respecting conscience. Very indicative to this is an Italian film that I suggest everybody to see, is Divorce in Italian Way. No, Marriage in Italian Way. It's about Sicily, and it's the story of a young girl who had a love story with a man, and then there is all these Sicilian rituals to repair the damage. And in fact it was brutality, because neither the young girl nor the young man, the young woman nor the young man wanted to marriage, but they have to. And for most of the film it appears as the violence in them, that they must marry. But then at the end the father of the young woman had a heart attack and he was dying. And his brother saw this and said, well, now I'm calling the doctor. And then the father said, no, if the doctor comes and people see that I'm dying, they will stop the marriage. So the shame will still subsist on our family. And although obviously I do not accept these practices, this cultural environment and so on, nevertheless I see some nobility, and some, if not nobility, at least something I really must respect in this person, ready to die in order to remove shame from his family. And if we take this stance, I think that looking at the intention of people are really an unavoidable part of classifying the acts as legitimate cases of civil disobedience, in order to distinguish these cases of simply acting for my personal interests, of acting cynically, and so on and so on.
Then I would have question about really the psychology, how deep has to be the explanation, but that would be another problem. Because no one can go in the head of people. No one can go in the head of people to see whether or not they are Frankfurt mechanism, for example, operating. It's just our interpretative scheme that given certain practices we can look at that way of acting as an expression of what we take to be this kind of thing.
Well, to this I have only the reply I heard from Timothy Williamson recently in Dubrovnik in a similar discussion, saying we have not certainty, but we have ways to access. And if you can say there are still doubts, then I can say there are still doubts about everything. So how can we know?
Not so strong. I was thinking about the depth of explanation.
The depth of explanation of what?
In terms or in relation of the actions that you are considering as civil disobedience. Because also you have a group of people, they can have different way to be part of that movement. So how do you calculate that? So it's a kind of common way in which they put forward
okay,
the argument.
I accept there can be vagueness, there can be people entering in the group just for the good party, and so on and so on. So certainly you can't have clear cuts. Nevertheless, you can have ways of showing sincerity from the movement in general, and also ways to, with more or less certainty, to establish whether they are really sincere or not. So, for example, people who stop their civil disobedience because holidays start, I would say it's a clear case that they were not sincere. Otherwise, a man ready to die, I would say, really was sincere. I cannot say that can be a stronger proof of this.
So, two other questions.
Okay, I have one question generally according to on civil disobedience. There's this argument that we hear now from Markovic, and I think that Barry is also right. I mean, if we give loose conditions or justifications of civil disobedience, then there will be social chaos. Or, for example, civil disobedience will replace democratic procedures, which I think this argument is obviously wrong. Because the people who engage in civil disobedience, they don't read Markovic or Berry, and outside there is no any social chaos or civil disobedience is replacing democratic institutions. I mean, for example, if we take France, a country where there is protests against every decision, it's hard to say that there is social chaos. Simply, more importantly, civil disobedience will become unimportant. It will become unserious. It will not be serious anymore. But it is too harsh to say if we give loose justification of civil disobedience, then it will come to social chaos, when absolutely it is not coming to social chaos. So people do not know what justifies civil disobedience, and there is no social chaos.
There can be two cases. One confirms what you are saying, but this I would say would be classified as not serious cases of civil disobedience. So let's stop the lectures at the faculty for 3 days, but let's really not damage the practices at the institution. So let's stop before the exams so that everybody can regularly finish the academic year, and so on and so on. This is a way of limiting, let's say. But the risk is that it becomes inefficacious.
Yeah, it's okay, but social chaos and all these...
No, the other solution is really going to the end. Is really creating social troubles. In this case, we have anarchy and social chaos. In Croatia, we have a mixture. We have a mixture of people that doing this unserious disobedience. So let's stop because now we have exams. Let's stop because now we have holidays. And this does not create social chaos, I agree. But I would say this also renders civil disobedience. The reason why it doesn't create social chaos is that in this case civil disobedience is inefficacious. If I were the government, I would never be moved by such a case of civil disobedience. I would laugh at them. Okay, be in the Varšavska in Zagreb. In any case, I know we will go with your own feet when holiday starts. So one risk is that civil disobedience become inefficacious. The other risk is social chaos, like for example these farmers who are really creating troubles to the state, or other people also. In this case, however, the social chaos is represented by the fact that the state surrenders whenever it happens. I mean, there are two habits of the Croatian government to react to civil disobedience. Either ignore it, more or less, or simply, okay, yes, we agree with you, and here is the money, and everybody goes at home happy. This, I think, is a case of anarchy and social chaos, in a state that the result of this policy is part of the explanation of the incredible economic crisis in which we are at the moment.
I agree, but I still don't see any examples of social chaos, because farmers were right in rebellion, because they were pressing government to do what they said they will do. So they were justified. So it's not social chaos.
I would call as an example of social chaos the fact that government cannot establish and the parliament cannot establish an economic politics at the beginning of the year, because at any moment with somebody will be, it's their fault, yes, but it's their fault because I would say the civil disobedience is so serendipity. Yeah. serendipitous, civil disobedience is example of that in Croatia. So I think that in fact we have social chaos.
Justified.
No,
That's what I want to say. It was
No.
justified.
what is justified?
Civil disobedience that brings to social chaos. If it brings to social chaos and it is justified, then we don't have problem.
No, I would say
Or you think that their civil disobedience wasn't justified?
so. Just a moment. What I was remarking, let's try to see what we are speaking about. I was remarking as social chaos cases of unreflective civil disobedience. So unreflective civil disobedience is either what I remarked earlier while discussing with Snježana, civil disobedience of part of society not coordinated with other parts of society. So too much disobediences, so the state cannot answer to all of them at the same time. Or another case of unreflective civil disobedience is civil disobedience for frivolous reasons. I would call the farmers' disobedience as civil as both. So it was totally unreflective about the interests of others. And second, it was also unreflective because, as I saw in economic analysis, for them for years it was easier to come to the state and say, give us money to repair the money.
Sorry. No, it's okay, it's okay. It's okay.
Yes, I'm not defending the state. I'm defending the absence of a conscience of what is proper civil disobedience, to which the state, if it is wise and after reflection, reacts positively by saying, yes, you are right, we the state were wrong, we the government were wrong, so we answer to your requirement. To what happens in Croatia, where everybody, it seems every social category protests whenever it wants, even from frivolous reasons, and most of the time the state react with clientelar politics, saying, okay, just stop the protest, just stop the disobedience, we give you the money you require. I would say it's fault on both sides. It's fault both on the state that accepts such situation, and it is fault of the side starting the protest. And I think the proper reaction of the state would say, your civil disobedience is frivolous, it is not supported by good reasons, we do not give you the money you require, and even more, we punish you. So is this absence of punishment, for example, one of the sources of favoring these frivolous cases of disobedience? And I think Croatia is an example of it.
Our disagreement is that I think that in Croatia people are not disobedient at all, that we have just few parts of civil disobedience, farmers, students, and marshals. All the other thing is actually, I don't think, maybe I'm not in everyday
Well,
politics.
these
I
three,
don't know.
there are other, let's say, sometimes the reaction of the government is preemptive. So, for example, whenever the veterans say, we will disobey, the government reacts preemptively, saying, well, yeah, obviously you are right, we give you whatever you require. So I put, in my discussion, I was thinking about real cases of disobedience and also of menacing disobedience. Not real cases, but something that would happen that was stopped only because the government answered positively even before it started. So, in fact, when speaking about Croatia, I was speaking about cases of civil disobedience and virtual cases of civil disobedience.
You're close, sir. Thank you very much. Thank you everybody for thoughts